You must take a closer look at these disturbing and incredible historical photos. Be sure to share your impressions in the comments. This 1892 portrait was built to exaggerate Amma Bataillard's height, tall military hat, long skirt, and a much shorter performer beside her. She was a French teenager touring America as a sideshow star, advertised as nearly 8 feet tall, but later measured closer to 7. On August 20th, 1944, Avenger bombers and Wildcat fighters from the United States escort carrier Bogue struck German submarine U-1229 in the North Atlantic. The submarine sank after the attack, and 41 crewmen were rescued from the water while this aerial photo captured the moment from above. Rose Foster, born Rosina, Kate Foster in Southampton in 1884, became a British sideshow performer while still a child. She was born without hands or legs, yet learned to dress herself, write, style her hair, and knit, as seen in this portrait. On May 12, 1962, the Encino test exploded above Christmas Island with a force of 500 kilotons. Its cloud climbed about 19 kilometers, turning one free-fall test into one of the Cold War's most striking images. In 1975, more than 300,000 Moroccans moved toward Western Sahara in the Green March, a state-organized push to take the territory from Spain. Spain agreed to leave just days before Francisco Franco died, a moment many saw as the final end of the Spanish Empire. In 1942, Zofia Posmish was 19 when this police photo was taken after she passed out leaflets against Nazi rule. She later survived Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, was freed in May 1945, and lived to 98 years old. In 1929, Benito Mussolini sat perfectly still while an artist turned his face into another tool of public image. That same year, he signed the Lateran Treaty with the Vatican, giving his rule a new level of influence in Italy. This 1958 photo shows 14-year-old Carole Ann Fugate being taken into custody after police captured her with 19-year-old Charles Starkweather in Wyoming. The case gripped America because she said she was forced to stay with him, while prosecutors argued she helped him during a crime spree linked to 11 victims. On June 19, 1944, 2 women in Carentan, France, placed flowers beside a roadside grave marked only by a cross, helmet, rifle, and gas mask. The cross read, "Mort pour la France," a French tribute meaning he had fallen for France, though his name is not visible in the photo. Boris Annenkov, a Cossack ataman from the Russian Civil War, was photographed shirtless in a Chinese prison after fleeing the collapsing white movement. His cropped hair, tattoos, and bare prison pose show how far he had fallen from feared commander to captive exile. Born Saida Salma in 1844, she grew up inside the ruling family of Zanzibar, then secretly left for Germany after a forbidden relationship with merchant Heinrich Ruete. As Emily Ruete, she later wrote the first known autobiography by an Arab woman, turning a royal scandal into one of the rarest female voices of the 19th century. In 1950, Cree boys in Moose Factory, Ontario, stood on their bunk beds for prayer inside a Canadian residential school dormitory. The photo is striking because the scene looks quiet, but it shows how even bedtime routines were controlled far from home. On May 24, 1926, the Owl, a fast Boston to New York passenger train, hit a freight train at a crossover in Mansfield, Massachusetts. The wreck twisted cars across several tracks, leaving 4 people injured and 1 person later confirmed dead. In the 1930s, Newcastle police recorded James Hargreaves Jones, not just by his face but by his exact method. His file says he begged in residential streets, then entered houses he found empty, turning a simple street approach into a warning sign. On August 29, 1943, a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress caught fire during engine startup at Chelveston Air Force Base in England. The problem began in an engine with a rebuilt carburetor, leaving ground crews fighting the blaze before the bomber even left the airfield. In the early 1900s, sideshow performers called Electra or Voltara sat in a fake electric chair and appeared to send sparks from their fingers. The secret was a hidden Tesla coil with low current, turning public fear of electricity into a stage trick that looked far more dangerous than it was. In July 1939, A man in Oklahoma City lay in a real bed outside his shack with scrap wood and tin turned into a roof above him. The photo looks almost staged, but it was Depression-era survival. A bedroom rebuilt in the open air from whatever he could find. In January 1946, 104 German rocket specialists stood together at Fort Bliss, Texas, after being brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Several had worked on the V-2 rocket, and their knowledge soon helped turn wartime technology into America's race for space. Between 1915 and 1926, encephalitis lethargica spread across the world and left many patients awake, but unable to move normally. Doctors saw people frozen in strange postures for years, and then the illness faded away without a clear explanation. In 1944, Warsaw's Prudential House was struck by a 2-ton German mortar shell during the Warsaw Uprising. The building was one of Poland's tallest before the war, and it stayed standing even after this direct hit. In 1974, protesters parked a rented moving truck outside the White House with the words, "Impeach Nixon," painted across its side. The photo became a blunt, Watergate-era message, taken only months before Richard Nixon resigned as President of the United States. In 1937, this West Virginia coal miner stood in his home still covered from work, heating food on a stove beside his bed. The room shows the hard reality of Scott's Run. Cracked walls, coal dust, and almost no line between the mine and home. In 1977, 2 Boeing 747 airliners collided on the runway at Tenerife Los Rodeos Airport after fog and radio confusion turned takeoff into disaster. This wreckage marks the deadliest accident in aviation history, with 583 people lost in a single airport crash. Around 1994, during the siege of Sarajevo, a young boy was photographed holding a rifle behind damaged glass in a city under constant pressure. The image is disturbing because it shows how the war reached even children, turning ordinary streets and windows into front lines. On May 11, 1938, Rose Kennedy posed with Kathleen and Rosemary at a public event, all smiling for the cameras. 3 years later, Rosemary Kennedy was given a lobotomy approved by her father, a decision that changed her life and became one of the Kennedy family's darkest secrets. In Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, around 1942, Japanese-American shop owners left this farewell sign before families were removed under wartime orders. The window still shows medicine, toothpaste, price tags, and a polite thank you note from a business that had to close almost overnight. On January 30th, 1972, this dairy street was photographed minutes before British paratroopers moved in during a civil rights march, later known as Bloody Sunday. The armored vehicles, stones on the road, and people watching from the corner capture the last tense moments before 14 civilians lost their lives. In the American South, segregation was printed even on drinking fountains, separating people at the most basic level of daily life. This photo is powerful because it shows inequality not in a courtroom, but in a public place where a child could see it every day. Around 1885, Native American children sat in rows inside the dining room of the Albuquerque Indian School in New Mexico. This was not just a meal room, because boarding schools used food, clothing, schedules, and language rules to separate children from their native traditions. In 1941, on the Eastern Front, a Russian woman stood beside train cars with a child in her arms and a metal can in her hand. Her face makes the photo unforgettable because she looks straight into the camera while carrying the quiet basics of survival: a child, a blanket, and a container for food or water. In 1985, Philadelphia police dropped an explosive on a row house linked to the group called MOVE, and the fire was allowed to spread through the block. This aerial photo shows the result. Rows of homes reduced to empty walls, nearly 2 city blocks destroyed, and 11 people lost. In 1949, this family was photographed at a Ku Klux Klan gathering on Stone Mountain near Atlanta, where organizers expected 1,000 new members, but only about 125 arrived. The most chilling detail is the child in matching robes, showing how the group tried to turn hate into a family ritual. Around 1935, these American girls wore dust masks because Dust Bowl storms pushed fine soil into streets, classrooms, and homes. In some plains towns, the air turned dark at midday, so masks like these became basic protection for breathing, not a strange costume. Around 1890, the Sutherland sisters became famous singers, but audiences often came just to see their floor-length hair. They turned that image into a business empire, selling hair tonic with their faces as the main advertisement. This Hungarian child sits inside a wooden baby walker called a kati, made to keep small children upright and close while parents worked. For farming families, it was both a simple walker and a low-cost substitute for constant childcare. On April 17, 1947, troops blocked roads near Texas City as smoke rose from burning oil facilities after a massive port disaster. It began with a ship fire and spread into nearby industrial sites, becoming one of the worst industrial accidents in United States history. In 1944, 19-year-old Phyllis Stalnaker was booked by San Diego police with labels that now sound more like social judgment than a serious crime. Her mugshot is striking because the file reduces a young woman to two harsh words: weedhead and tramp. On May 23, 1934, police in Louisiana ended the Bonnie and Clyde manhunt with a roadside ambush near Sales. This photo of their Ford shows why the case became legendary. The car itself turned into evidence of how violently America's most famous outlaw chase ended. On May 6, 1968, photographer Gilles Caron captured a protester throwing a paving stone on Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris. The smoke, torn pavement, and empty street show the moment France's student protests shifted from marches into open street confrontation. On April 30, 1945, a bugler played taps at Margraten American Military Cemetery in the Netherlands, days before Germany surrendered. Behind him were thousands of wartime crosses for United States soldiers who died during the final push into Germany. In 1935, during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, a Catholic priest blessed heavy machine guns lined up in front of Italian colonial troops. The photo is shocking because the ceremony was aimed not only at the soldiers, but directly at the weapons they were about to use. On May 3, 1945, Swiss border guards and Liechtenstein auxiliary police watched the Austrian and German frontier as the war in Europe was almost over. The sign behind them shows Liechtenstein's border crossing, a tiny neutral state standing between Switzerland and the collapsing Nazi Reich. On April 16, 1945, United States soldiers of the 255th Infantry Regiment moved through Waldenburg after the 63rd Division entered the town. The photo shows the last weeks of the war in Germany at street level. Smoke, ruined houses, and a church tower still standing above the wreckage. On May 23, 1928, Fulton Fish Market workers displayed a giant sturgeon caught near the Virginia coast, weighing about 750 kilograms. The fish was so large, it had to be shown on a wheeled platform, drawing a crowd around one of the market's strangest catches. In April 1941, South African infantry used a cactus hedge as cover while moving around Italian positions at Kombolcha in Ethiopia. The detail that makes the photo unusual is the setting. Desert plants became natural camouflage during a planned surprise attack. This is Dresden after the British and American air raids of February 1945, with the historic center reduced to roofless stone shells. The photo is powerful because Dresden was not a frontline battlefield, yet it became one of World War II's most debated bombing sites. In 1921, Ukrainians in Alexandrovsk, now Zaporizhzhia, waited outside a Red Cross canteen during the famine and Civil War aftermath. The sign says the site was subsidized by The Joint, a relief organization helping keep emergency food points open when whole families arrive together. Maijishan in Gansu, China is a 142-meter cliff filled with Buddhist caves, stairways, statues, and ancient murals. Its name means Wheat Stack Mountain, and the monastery was carved into the rock face more than 1,500 years ago. This photo shows a Serbian paramilitary commander posing with a firearm during the breakup of Yugoslavia, when militias became major forces on the ground. He later faced an international indictment over wartime abuses, but died in Belgrade in 2000 before any trial took place. In 1965, Mary Shotwell Little vanished after buying groceries in Atlanta, and her car later appeared with the groceries still inside and signs of a struggle. The case became even stranger when the woman who replaced her at work was later found dead, leaving one of Georgia's most unsettling, unsolved mysteries. John McNutt was only 17 when he joined the 141st Pennsylvania Infantry by claiming he was 18. He was struck at Gettysburg on July 2, 1863, and died the next day, making this blurred portrait one of the last traces of a teenage soldier. The 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis became chaotic, with dust, heat, wild dogs, sickness, and one runner disqualified for riding in a car. Thomas Hicks still won after being given brandy and small doses of strychnine during the race. During Mongolia's Stalinist purges from 1937 to 1939, more than 18,000 Buddhist monks disappeared from religious life through arrests, camps, and executions. Over 700 monasteries were closed or destroyed, cutting down a Buddhist culture that had shaped Mongolia for centuries. In September 1942, one torpedo spread from Japanese submarine Warrior 19 hit 3 American ships, Wasp, O'Brien, and North Carolina. This photo caught the rare moment O'Brien was struck while Wasp was already smoking on the horizon. In the early 1980s, Times Beach, Missouri was evacuated after roads treated with waste oil were found contaminated with dioxin. The town was later bought out and erased, turning a small community into one of America's most famous toxic cleanup sites. On June 11, 1964, Willy Walter Seifert entered a schoolyard in Volkhoven, Germany, with a homemade fire device and a lance. The classroom photo is haunting because the attack lasted only minutes, yet it left 8 children and 2 teachers dead and changed German school safety forever. On November 13, 1982, South Korean boxer Duk Koo Kim fought Ray Mancini for the world lightweight title and collapsed after the 14th round. Kim died 4 days later, and the tragedy helped push championship boxing from 15 rounds down to 12. Black Bart robbed stagecoaches for 8 years without the usual outlaw image, often appearing calm, polite, and well-dressed. He became famous for leaving poems at 2 robbery scenes, turning a wanted poster into part of the legend around his name. In February 1960, an airliner crashed near Shannon Airport, and 26 people were lost as most of the aircraft broke apart on impact. The tail section remained almost alone, while workers searched the wreckage for mail scattered among thousands of papers. On January 30, 1972, British soldiers opened fire during a civil rights march in Derry, Northern Ireland, in the event later called Bloody Sunday. This photo shows civilians lined against a fence moments around the crackdown, before 14 people ultimately lost their lives. So, in 1952, oil and industrial waste on Cleveland's Cuyahoga River caught fire, sending thick smoke across the waterfront. The river burned more than once, and these fires later became a symbol of America's polluted industrial age. In 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 ran out of fuel at 41,000 feet and became known as the Gimli Glider. The pilots brought the Boeing 767 down on a former airbase racing strip in Manitoba, and all 69 people on board survived. In August 1968, Warsaw Pact tanks entered Prague to crush the Prague Spring reforms that had loosened censorship and travel controls. This photo shows a protester standing on a tank with a Czechoslovak flag, one of the most famous symbols of civilian defiance against Soviet power. On February 16, 1942, German submarine U-502 struck the Venezuelan oil tanker SS Monegas near Aruba, leaving it burning off the coast. The attack showed that the Battle of the Atlantic had reached the Caribbean oil routes, not just distant ocean lanes. From 1948 to 1986, Soviet prison guard Danzig Baldaev recorded more than 3,000 inmate tattoos, building a rare archive of Russia's prison code. In this photo, the stars, churches, skulls, and slogans on bare skin could show rank, prison history, and status inside the criminal world. Robert Wadlow, the tallest man ever recorded, was photographed aboard the ocean liner Queen Mary, towering over the deck in a regular suit. His height made even the ship's doorway look small, turning a luxury voyage into one of the rarest images of his short life. Alaska, late 19th century. Crewmen posed on an unidentified ship with 2 polar bears spread across the deck. The photo shows the scale of Arctic hunting at the time, when a single voyage could bring back food, hides, and rare trophy images like this. On March 18, 1967, the tanker Torrey Canyon hit rocks near Cornwall and spilled millions of gallons of crude oil into the sea. Britain later bombed the wreck to burn the oil, turning one navigation mistake into a disaster that changed modern spill response laws. On December 31, 1940, miners in McIntyre, Pennsylvania, posed after surviving a coal mine explosion, still covered in coal dust. Their raised hands and blackened faces make the photo clear. This was not before work, but after escaping one of America's most dangerous jobs. On April 17, 1943, U-175 was brought to the surface and sunk by the United States Coast Guard cutter Spencer in the Atlantic. This photo caught Obersteuermann Helmut Klotsch shouting for help in the water, a rare close image of a U-boat survivor seconds after the fight ended. In March 1936, this ice jam packed the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh's Point Bridge after a winter that dropped more than 63 inches of snow. Days later, rain and rapid melting pushed the rivers to a 46-foot crest, flooding downtown Pittsburgh in the Great St. Patrick's Day flood. In 1945, a Soviet crew fired a 203mm B-4 heavy howitzer in the streets during the Battle of Berlin. This weapon was built for fortifications, but here it was being used at close range between houses in the final fight for the city. In 1912, these workers rode high above the city on a crane's chains, using the same rigging that lifted heavy steel. The photo is shocking because the men are standing in open air without modern harnesses, while buildings and the river sit far below them. On February 2, 1944, freed Korean laborers on Kwajalein helped United States troops read a map and locate Japanese military positions. Many Koreans had been brought into Japan's wartime labor system, so their knowledge became useful immediately after they were freed. During a 1949 polio quarantine, this mother lay outside a basement window to read to her 6-year-old child without entering the room. Before the polio vaccine, families used window visits like this because close contact could spread the disease and children were especially vulnerable. Around 1935 in London, Albert Johann Kramer stood 7 feet 9.5 inches beside Joseph Fassler, who was 3 feet 6 inches tall. Their extreme height contrast became a touring act, and Kramer remains the tallest recorded person from the Netherlands. Around 1906, photographer Herbert Ponting captured a man leaning over the crater rim of Mount Aso in Japan, while another man held him back with a strap. The scene shows early volcano tourism at its rawest. No railings, no safety gear, just a smoking crater and one careful grip. In East Beirut in 1978, a Christian militia fighter posed with an FNFL rifle during the Lebanese Civil War. The cross on his chest and military gear on his belt show how religion, identity, and armed factions were openly mixed in the city. On November 6, 1955, the Soviet Union tested the RDS-27 device at Semipalatinsk with a yield of about 250 kilotons. It was a short-lived design because only 16 days later, the stronger 2-stage RDS-37 test made this weapon path obsolete. In 1958, the Manchester United team plane crashed during takeoff at Munich Riem Airport after a refueling stop on the way home from a European match. The disaster ultimately claimed 23 lives, including 8 United players from the young team remembered as the Busby Babes. On February 13, 1945, Soviet troops entered Budapest after a 50-day siege that left much of the city damaged. This photo shows Red Army soldiers standing in the captured Hungarian capital, where German and Hungarian forces had just surrendered after one of the hardest urban battles in Europe. On August 14, 1944, Korean women held by the Japanese military were questioned by United States Army personnel after the siege of Myitkyina in Burma. The photo is important because it documents survivors of Japan's wartime comfort women system at the moment their stories began entering official military records. In 1930, tourists rode a motorcycle to the rim of Halemaumau crater at Kilauea, then known as the House of Everlasting Fire. The sign listed a crater 1,500 feet wide and 650 feet deep, yet visitors stood almost at the edge with no modern barrier. Around 1890, this San Francisco Chinatown smoking room shows the full setup: raised bed, pipe, lamp, tray, and an attendant watching the doorway. Images like this were later used to portray Chinese immigrant districts as dangerous, strengthening anti-Chinese fear after the Chinese Exclusion Act. This 1950s photo shows a coelacanth, a rare deep-sea fish once believed to have vanished with the dinosaurs. Scientists were stunned because living coelacanths proved that a fossil fish had survived for millions of years in the Indian Ocean. At 80 years old, Danny Hodge squeezed an apple with one hand until the juice ran out in front of a public audience. He was a former wrestler and boxer with a famously powerful grip, and this photo shows the exact strength trick that made people keep talking about him for decades. This 1952 photo from Severodvinsk shows a huge whale left on shore after the tsunami that struck the Kuril Islands. The disaster followed a powerful earthquake near Kamchatka and became one of the worst natural catastrophes in the Soviet Far East. On February 1, 1979, London's Soho filled with piles of uncollected rubbish during a sanitation workers' strike in Britain's winter of discontent. The strike became a national symbol of the crisis, with city streets, hospitals, and public services all hit by labor disputes. In May 1945, Red Army soldiers fought on Berlin's Frankfurter Allee, using street railings and rubble for cover as buildings burned behind them. This was one of the final urban battles in Europe, with Soviet troops moving block by block through the capital of the Third Reich. On December 16, 1920, a massive earthquake struck Gansu, China, destroying towns, roads, and homes across a freezing mountain region. About 270,000 people lost their lives, including many who survived the shaking, but had no shelter in the winter cold. On September 29, 1963, Soviet nuclear submarine K-181 surfaced at the North Pole after finding a rare opening in the ice. The ice there was only 30 to 50 centimeters thick, thin enough for the submarine to break through and mark a major Arctic naval milestone. In 1873, the huge Fort McHenry flag was photographed 61 years after it survived the British bombardment of Baltimore. This was the same flag Francis Scott Key saw in 1814, inspiring the words that later became the United States national anthem. After the April 1906 San Francisco earthquake, this streetcar route was left with cracked pavement, broken sidewalks, and rails bent out of alignment. The damage shows how ground movement broke the city's transport system before fires destroyed much of San Francisco. Around 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion in China, 5 bound men knelt near the shoreline, while armed guards and onlookers stood behind them. The photo is a stark record of public punishment during a violent anti-foreign uprising that drew China and Western powers into open conflict. In 1931 or 1932, this family stood outside a makeshift shelter in a Great Depression refugee camp in the United States. Families from eastern states moved between camps like this after jobs vanished, carrying children, bedding, and tools into homes built from scrap wood and cloth. In 1968, during the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, a Soviet soldier pointed his rifle at a Czech protester standing on a damaged T-55 tank. The tank's engine was already burning, showing how Prague residents resisted the invasion with street blockades, sabotage, and direct confrontation. In June 1972, Galveston Bay in Texas was packed with offshore oil wells, with drilling platforms standing across the shallow water. The photo shows how close heavy energy production once sat to the coastline, long before modern debates over offshore drilling became common. In 1878, Rath and Wright's yard in Dodge City, Kansas, held about 40,000 bison hides stacked for the commercial hide trade. A pile this size shows how fast the Great Plains bison herds were being turned into an industry before they nearly disappeared.